Dagnabbit, I forgot to press record. Because it looks like the stream is unstable again. So this has been recorded again locally, and the upload will be put onto YouTube afterwards without any stuttering or interruptions. So from the beginning, welcome to Creator Mass 2019 episode 7, where we create products for IMVU using Blender 2.8 plus. So that's any version in the 8 series. And yesterday, as we were saying, we were making this what should have been a beanie, but it ended up looking like a headscarf. So we're going to try that again and see if we can do it in the allotted time that we have. So just type hippie beanie into your favorite search engine and you'll get lots of reference images for the type of thing that we're going for. And as mentioned yesterday, when we're doing hats or hair coverings for IMVU, we've got a particular problem in that we can't obviously put a hat over the hair and have it cover the hair unless it's part of the design of the hat. So we kind of have to design the hats to be just accessories in their own rights, which will remove the hair or will require the user to remove the hair in order to use the hat. So we'll do it as if they've got their hair all scrunched up inside the beanie. Right, so for this, we do need to start with the accessory file. And those are, where's the URL for that? The accessory files for Blender 2.8, or the starter files. Right, so those are, I'll drop this link in chat. So that's where the starter files are. If you want to learn more about using Blender for IMVU or Blender 2.8 for IMVU, just go to this URL. Right, so starter file. So create a new general. Then all we're going to do is drag and drop the female accessory blend into the application. Open. And that's the accessory file. You can also load it obviously from File, Open. That'll bring up the file browser, and then just browse to wherever you've got the file located and select it and bring it in. Open. So we're going to do something similar to yesterday and drop in a box from the Add menu, Mesh, Cube. That'll be tiny and dropped in at the feet of the avatar. So scale that up just so that we can see it. And then position that at the head. So what we can do from here, let's have a look. So what we want is a shape that's going to fit the head, so it'll be narrower at the front and as it moves to the back it'll be wider. So what we're aiming for is something that's akin to, looks like ET's head. Something that's akin to that. So we've got, so we're going to need to shape the neck, and then the rest of this is just the back of the, and gravity. So let's try a slightly different way of doing this. Edit mode, extrude, and we're going to extrude, so we want to be in face, extrude this back face. So click the extrude tool, we'll get the little widget handle, just pull on that and then just do it twice. That's all we need. And to deactivate the tool, select another tool or one of the widgets. So let's just do some basic shaping. So move, and rotate. Edges, and what you're going to do is just switch between, whoops, that's gone a bit wonky. It's just switch between the different modes of selection, just so that you can roughly shape the object. Alright, so we want a loop cut down the center, just the one. So that's hovering over a vertical edge will create, horizontal edge will create a vertical cut, because what you're actually doing is cutting the edge to create the loop, and it does that through all the horizontal edges. Or selecting a vertical edge will cut that in half and create a loop around the mesh. So you activate the tool, move the mouse over the edge that that's going to be split, and create your loop, and then just click to add it, just the once in this instance. And all we're going to do is switch between the different modes, selection modes, and just block out a very basic shape. Alright, so I want it to be slightly larger at the back. Edges. Scale. Whoops. So get rid of these faces. We don't need those. Still kind of looks like a headscarf. Let's just save this. Save as. Creator mass 2019 7 1. Add a loop cut, a loop cut, and a loop cut. So what we're trying to do is just basically follow the basic shape of the head and make sure that we don't get any clipping. Where we haven't made an allowance for the structure of the head. But the problem is that it's too easy to get carried away with adding lots of structure, and before you know it, you've got something, you've got a mesh that's basically a little out of control because you've got too much structure. So to edge slide, you can either double tap the G key, or, which is the one, I think it's this one, yeah. So we've got an edge slide tool, or click that to activate, if it'll activate, come on, there we go. And then click drag on the highlighted element and it'll slide the edge along. Alright, how does it to vert? Where is it? Oh, edge vertex. There we go, vertex slide. So there we go. So we've got two options to either slide an edge. So that would be an edge. Or vertices or vertexes. But double tapping the keyboard is usually a little quicker. So that's the top of the head. So let's add a loop cut. So I wonder. I wonder if we can rotate this front edge. Right, so we're going to get some clipping at the top, that's fine. So should we collapse these two? So double tap, and these ones as well, double tap. Get rid of those. So select all, mesh, clean up, and this is remove doubles, which is now called merge by distance. Because what this thing is actually shaped like is just basically a tube. Looks like the alien's head. Xenomorph. Right, so do we want it covering the ears? Yes. That's going to be rather large, so let's shrink that down. Move these back faces Let's switch our transform orientation. So at the moment it's in global, which means the widget is orientated relative to the view, but what we want is for it to be orientated relative to the selection. Why is that not doing that? Okay, that's weird. It should be orientating itself. Oh, and it is. Let's try normal then. So sometimes depending on the orientation of the selection, whoops, Mr. Vertex, local doesn't always work. So you can switch to normal, which then takes into consideration, let's see if we can show this. No, it's not there anymore, is it? It's in here. Right, here we go. Oh, and of course, IMVU scaling means that, oh, there we go. So those arrows, not arrows, those lines are the orientation of individual faces. So if we select one of those, we can see that the widget, 3D widget, aligns itself relative to the face normal, whereas with local it doesn't. Obviously there's some math behind why it does that, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. So sometimes, as we were saying, the local, which is what you would ordinarily use, doesn't work, or it doesn't work the way that you're expecting it to. So what you can do is switch to normal, and that will follow the alignment of the selections, which is often much easier to manipulate. Let's turn those off. But hats, in general, whoops, are quite tricky to do. Because you have to figure out whether you are going to design the hat, make the hat to fit the default avatar's head, which is what you should generally do anyway, versus a specific avatar head, which is much more tricky to do because generally speaking you don't have access to the avatar, the creator of those particular heads used or created in order to make their own custom products. So it can be a lot of trial and error if you are trying to make your hat fit a particular design. Okay, so we're now starting to get somewhere, but we can see how it's not always as straightforward as one might think. There's a lot of just playing with shapes and their positions, their orientations relative to whatever it is that you're trying to do. So if you're trying to make your hat for a custom avatar, unfortunately we don't have access to the avatars that creators make in order to make their own clothing products. So all those real life sized clothing items and avatars, you won't necessarily be able to just... Let's see if we can disable some of these. Hold on. So what we're going to do is all this text gets in the way, and there's a lot of bones. So what we can do, we don't need the skeletons, so what we can do in the outliner is just turn those off by clicking the little checkbox, and it just hides all the bones, the avatars, not the avatars, the armatures. That's the word I was looking for. Hides all the armatures so that we're not staring at all that text. Right, so now we're getting somewhere. So let's hide the head for a moment and the hair. Whoops. Because we want to add some loop cuts to this, but we want to be very specific about where we place them. I wonder if the knife tool, so let's use the knife tool. So this is something that we've not used before. Knife tool. Click that, and we can mouse over edges or vertices as our starting point for a cut. And you have to be quite precise with this. So you have to have the tip of the knife. Oh, it just changes the cursor. The tip of the knife needs to be on the vertex if you are using your vertexes as your starting point. And just click, and then we'll get this line appearing. And then just click when it highlights an edge. And this could be tricky because... oh no, we can move. Excellent. So what we did there was... oh, we can't do it when we've got that active. So I'll have to escape that. So this is where you need to be using your middle mouse button to manipulate the scene, because we don't have access to the scene widget if you've been using those or that to manipulate the scene. So knife tool again, click on our edges. So we want to trace this edge down to this vertex, but we can't quite place a node point on this edge. So middle mouse click, drag, and we can move the scene around. And then it'll snap to that end vertex, which is our termination point. So click, and then enter. And that's created a manually placed loop cut that terminates on some specific vertexes. So we can select these and start. We'll put the head back in a second. So we want to do another one from this vertex and terminating on that one, I guess it's going to be. So knife tool again. Click, 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 click. And then snap, click, enter. Alright, so let's put the head back. Where's the hair gone? There we go. Oh, you see. So that's what happens if you're not precise enough with your vertex placement. So what we can do here, we want to get rid of this one and this one. So what's happened there is it's placed two cuts because we weren't accurate enough with our node placement. Unfortunately, the tool, if you activate the tool using the icon, there's no help as to which vertex is going to be your starting point. But if you initialize the tool pressing the K shortcut key, we get this little green helper dot, this thing, and that snaps to the nearest vertex or the nearest edge, which is much more intuitive to use as a tool. So we need to get rid of those. Whoops, escape. We need to get rid of these. So we want this vertex to be the one that remains. So what we can do here is select that first, click, and then shift click the other two. And then from the mesh menu, now where is it? So this is the problem with 10 Blender 2.8, being so used to the previous versions, trying to remember where everything is. Oh, there it is, merge vertexes, or merge vertices. So that's vertex, merge vertices, and then we want at first, which is the first vertex that we selected, and these two will jump to this one. Where's the cursor gone? Oh, there it is. Vertex, merge vertices at first, and that gets rid of those stray vertices. So double check on the other side, and we've got the same thing there as well. So we want that to be our vertex, so select the second one, edge at first. So we need to double check these just to make sure. That's that's okay. So let's continue. So we mentioned this yesterday, that when you are making your hats in particular, or when you are making something that's supposed to match something on the avatar, you want to start off with very simple basic shapes first, and then add structure to them as you go, making them more detailed and more complex, as that makes it easier to manipulate your initial shapes that you can then add detail to, or when you add your detail, you're already structurally following the shape that you need to follow. Right, so and it's okay for some items not to be perfectly symmetrical. So we've got a collapsed edge here, or a collapsed face. So we talked about this yesterday, but basically this surface is a quad. They call them quadratic faces, and it's comprised of two triangles. So there's a dividing line that cuts the quad in two. So from these corners, the orientation of the diagonal can be from that corner to that corner, or this corner to this corner. And depending on the orientation of that edge, that's, although we can't see it, there is an edge there, otherwise the face wouldn't be able to collapse like that. Wouldn't collapse like this. So what we can do to address this is break the face down into its core components, which are the two triangles. So we select the face, and then from the face menu, triangulate faces. Oh, and that's automatically corrected the orientation of the edge. So it now, whoops, instead of being diagonal that way and making the surface concave, it switched it to that way, which has made the surface convex. So we could now, should now be able to re-quadify that, tris the quads, And it should keep, yeah, it's kept that orientation. And the other side, this is its sibling. And that's done the same thing. Let's add a bit of smoothing to this, see what that does. Object, shade smooth. That looks kind of mushy. So, what do we need to do to this? Right. There's quite a few of these faces actually. So the shortcuts for that is Control T to split, to triangulate, and then Alt J to join the selections back together again. So whenever you see that a face appears to collapse on one side but not on the other, it's more than likely because the edge orientation suits, so this edge orientation suits this half of the mesh, whereas this one, which is following the same orientation on this side, doesn't. So we want this edge to be orientated that way. We do that by selecting the edge, then edge, rotate clockwise, and that'll orientate, whoops, that'll reorient the edge. So we can join those back together. Save this, save as. So let's create, I need a bit of depth to this, or a brim. So we're just going to select that loop and just extrude it. I wonder what's the best way to do this. Instead of using the tool, use the shortcut key. So press the E key and that extrudes, and then press escape just to release it. Because what we want to do next is scale. Don't know if this will work. Scale. Oh yes, it has, that's fine. So we're scaling along the normals of the edges. So in the same way that we were manipulating these faces at the back using the normals, scaling can do the same thing. So you can either scale along an orientation, or you can scale along the normals. And we do that by clicking inside the circle rather than on one of the axes. So all that's done is just created a little brim. Giving us a little bit of thickness. And we might run out of time on this project, but as you're probably guessing already just by what we're doing, the hats, hair, anything to do with the avatar's head is a little bit more time consuming to make than a lot of other products, because you're not just making something. So you're not just making a couch or a tie or an accessory. Whatever it is that you're making has to fit the avatar, and that's where most of your time is going to be taken up, is making sure that your design fits the avatar. Right, so we need a bit more detail. So what we're going to do, add a loop cut that terminates at this front edge, but it starts at that and cuts across these two so that we've got a bit more shape that we can add to this section of the mesh. So using the knife tool, initializing this time with a shortcut so that we get that little helper that snaps to the vertex we want, and just drag our cut line out. The same on the other side. Let's try switching to global, local, still not doing it, so for normal. Don't want to be too far away from the head or the hair, because it makes the thing look a bit too big. But we don't want to be too close either. So let's add, I think from here to here, across there. So knife. So we can almost call that our very basic shape. That's taken quite a bit of tweaking to get that. So what we want to do cut those two edges or let's try so that's automatically reorientated the edge because this one was that way, that one was that way. So join those two back together. Whilst they're selected, we can still do that. So Alt J. Dagnabbit, Alt J. But what we want is for there to be an indentation here. So this loop that describes this shape, instead of going down here, ideally we want it going down here. So select that edge and that edge, split that, subdivide. That creates a set of vertices because it splits the edge. And it'll cause those faces to collapse on themselves because what we've done there is created what's called an n-gon. So if we look at this closest set of faces, so before there was an edge that joined these two that basically made that a quad and that a quad. But with the addition of this vertex here, we've now created what's called an n-gon, or a surface with more than four faces, more than four sides, I should say. So that's got 5. The same with the one on top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have to triangulate, triangulate, and then just redistribute the triangles and create additional quads from that subdivision. So if I undo that and do that, so there's this lone triangle here that terminates, doesn't do anything really to aid the shape, but if we move the mesh around we can see that there is a forced edge down here, but we can't make this triangle belong to this n-gon. So what we have to do is split this one up like thus. So we create 3 triangles from our n-gon, which now means that we can create 2 quads. So we select one, twist the quads, select the other, twist the quads, and we've now created a different type of edge flow on those 2 faces. We'll do the same thing in the bottom here. So what we've essentially done is shifted that triangle that was here, and we're going to shift it essentially down here. So you can see how that's now created a triangle and a quad. Do the same thing on the other side. And now that bulge at the back flows more naturally around the mesh. So let's save this here. Save as. I don't think we're going to get time to finish this today in the meshing, for the meshing. So what we'll do next, we can come back to this probably tomorrow actually and do a bit more work on this. But what we'll do in the meantime is take a look at adding materials, creating UV maps, and then possibly even creating a texture map that we can export, because we can always come back to this at another date. So in fact we might just continue on with this tomorrow. So what we'll do now, so we've saved the file, so what we'll do is add a material to this. So we've already added some smooth shading, which, a little bit about that. So when you make your meshes, or when you drop an object into a project, it's always going to be faceted like this. So we're always going to get all these hard lines all over the place, because each surface is treated as an individual surface. So the lighting, the way that they are lit or illuminated, is relative to themselves. So they're all unique. So they're all unique, but we don't want that. What we want is for them to be not unique and part of the collective. So we want the lighting to be more uniform to get rid of all these hard edges. And the way we do that is by adding smoothing. So that's object, shade smooth. And that treats all the surfaces as though they are part of a larger unit. And that just helps with the illusion of a much more complex surface than we might otherwise see if we were looking at the facets. So with that in mind, let's now add a material. So this should have a default material assigned to it. So material properties, oh it doesn't. Excellent, so we get to create one. Unless there is one. No, nice, we get to create it from scratch. So for materials, let me just drop a link in. Materials. Right, so material basics. So to create our material, in material properties, click the new button. That'll create a selection. It'll populate the panel and drop in all of these settings. For IMVU, the first thing we want to do is make sure the name is correct relative to what IMVU is looking for. So either click the name in the input field or double click in the material list. Either one doesn't matter. And then we want this to be Beanie, and then we have to get these right for IMVU. So we need square brackets. So that's Beanie space, square brackets, and then a number. So this is the one and only, so it'll be 0. Close square brackets. And that's our IMVU compatible material. We next need to assign an image to this, because all this is doing is just creating a basic set of properties. So in shading workspace, click that, and it'll switch to, and we'll have to scroll all the way out. Let's focus on the Beanie a bit more. So view, frame selected. That means that we're now rotating around the scene relative to the object that we are focused on. So that's the 3D view at the top. We've got the node or shader editor at the bottom. And to this we want to add an image node. So from the add menu, add texture, image texture. So that's add texture, image texture. Click to drop that in place. And we've got an option. We can either create a temporary texture, or we can load in something that we've already created externally. So if you click the open button, that will bring up the file browser where it'll show all the textures that you can load into the material. Or if you click new, it'll bring up this little pop-up where you can create a new material or a new texture. So 512 by 256. No alpha. Generated type. It's best to use UV grid or color grid so that we can see what we're doing, or see how the texture distributes over the mesh. Then OK, and then connect it together. Left click color, drag that to base color. And there is our image, and of course it's all skew-eyed because we need to correct the UV map, which we can now do. So that is a very basic material for IMVU. So next, UV mapping. So we're going to UV mapping or UV editing mode, or the UV editing workspace. We have to scroll out again. Our object will already be selected and in edit mode so that we can, I don't know if you can see that, so that UVs will be selectable. So let's go to texture mode. So this is middle mouse click drag. We'll drag the header so that you can select your options, your display options. So we've got what is it? Rendered, material preview, solid, and wireframe. So rendered, material preview, solid, and wireframe. So what we want to do next is select all, and this shows us the original UV map that was assigned to the box, because remember we started this from a cube. But what we want to do obviously is correct that so that we are now mapping the image. So we are mapping the image to our object properly. So for that, we select everything, select all, and then from the UV menu, just click unwrap. And that'll redo or redistribute the UV. Move that up there so it's easy to see. But we can see then how it's corrected the map. So that's what it was before. And that's what it's like after. What we can do now is Let's take a look. Okay, so we won't do this. We won't do what I was about to do today because there isn't enough mesh structure here. But tomorrow, if we do some more editing to this and add more structure, we might be able to play around with the UV map a bit more. But suffice to say, once you've got your UV map done, we have our editing or manipulation tools. So we've got move, rotate, scale, and transform. And transform is a special one. This is, well, they're all special because we never had these before. But transform is special because when that's active, we get a widget. We finally have a widget. So the way this works, each of the edges, corners, and this little thing, this little, I don't know what, node, that's the word I was looking for, this little node and this little cross in the center, each of those is a manipulation point. So the edges manipulate the UVs in those specific directions. The corners manipulate in 2 axes, so left, right, up, down. The node rotates, and it rotates around the X that's in the middle there. And then the X, that's our move or strafe or translate. But what's interesting about this is that if the widget is active, and depending on what selection mode that we're in, what element selection mode we're in, we get an appropriate widget for the element that's selected. But for vertexes, we get the familiar axis widget, but any of the other modes, we get a smaller version of the global transform widget when we've got the main object selected. So let's zoom in on that a little bit. So vertices, we have the standard XY manipulator. Edges or any of the others, we get the standard transform widget. And then of course for our selection modes we have the one we're in at the moment, which is island. So that is a selection of a complete UV map section. We have faces, that's individual faces of the UV, edges, individual edges, and vertexes or vertices for individual vertices. So let's do let's just give this thing a UV map and do a quick export test. So that's our UV map for this object. There's something else. Oh yes, texture maps. Texture map. Okay, so create your texture map. So whilst you've got everything selected in the 3D view which exposes your UV map, from the UV menu we can select Export UV Layout. Click that and then we can save a UV, not a UV map, we can save the UV map as an image. So all UVs, get a selection of the type that we want, we can set the size. The fill opacity, that basically means that the map is a wireframe versus just a flat color. I think it's 1. So if we just call this Beanie brackets UV and export, that should create a UV map. Where is it? As a PNG texture. So there it is. There's our Beanie texture map. So that's the thing that would go on the product page for people to derive from or use as their derivations. So back to, let's save this. Save as version 4. So what we want to do now is turn this into an accessory item. So we need the skeletons. So we need to re-enable the skeletons. What we want is the head. So let's get rid of these for now. Hide those so we can see what we're doing. We don't want this one. That's the attachment. We want this one, which is the head bone, or the armature that represents the head bone. And what we're going to do, select the mesh, edit mode, make sure everything is selected, all, object properties, vertex groups. I'm going to click the plus button to create a new vertex group. That's going to be called group. Double click that and then type attachment root. And it's case sensitive, so it's uppercase A and uppercase R for attachment and root. It's all one word. And then click the assign button, and that assigns this group to all the vertices of the mesh. And we can test that with select and deselect. So that's the group setup. Next, we want to be in modifiers, and we want to add an armature. So this is an armature block. Click on the little eyedropper and then click on the armature that's going to be associated with this mesh. In this instance it's the head bone, or the head armature. So click that and it appears as the control object of the armature. So that now means we can test this. So if we select the armature, go into pose mode, so we can click the bones to select them as we normally would do. Just press the R key and we can test which bone controls the mesh. So that works. So we're doing this for two reasons. One is to make sure that the armature has full control over the mesh, and also that when the armature is moved, we don't have any stray vertices left behind that have not been properly weighted to the mesh, because when the armature moves it'll distort the mesh. So if you move something, or if you export your product or your item into IMVU, and when the avatar animates it does all sorts of weird distortions, the likely problem or the likely cause of that is that your weight painting or your vertex groups haven't been assigned fully to the entire mesh. So with that done, object mode, we can save this, save as, and we should be able to export this now. Did we name it? No, we didn't name it. So object properties, the ID field where it says cube at the moment, so double click and just call that beanie.mesh. This is optional, but it just helps if you're exporting multiple meshes or you are working on multiple meshes within a project. Helps identify them. So there's our beanie mesh. Let's save over that. Then we can export. So to do that, make sure this is an accessory, so make sure nothing is selected. File, export, FBX. And then in the export settings for FBX, make sure selected objects is deselected. Everything else is okay. In geometry, we can leave apply modifiers. In armatures, always make sure add leaf bones is deselected, and we don't need any animation, so we can deselect that as well. Change the file name if you need to, and or the save location, and then just export. And that will have exported the file. So IMVU, create mode, derive new product. This is a female accessory. Go. So there's the default, which is a set of rather large shades. So to import, we want FBX import. So click on that and then click on the load FBX button. We get a file browser and we need to browse to our file, create a mess 7. There it is. Select, open. This gives us the select skeleton root dialog box, and for accessories, as we've been talking about in the previous videos, always select the one that starts root node, and that should always be 2 bones and 1 mesh. Those 2 bones being attachment root and attachment node, and of course the 1 mesh is the mesh that we're bringing in. So select, there's our beanie mesh, and then OK. It's red. Why is it red? It's red because it's telling us that it's going to override something, if I remember correctly. Oh no, it's detected missing textures. That's right, because we used a temporary texture. So if you do that, if you create something using that's it. If you create something using a grid texture like this, it's not real. So IMVU doesn't know what it is. So although the FBX exports correctly with all the right information, the actual image that's associated with the object, IMVU can't figure out what's going on there. So it's got a reference, but it doesn't have an actual bitmap image. So it'll go red like that as a warning. But that's okay, because everything that we need has been brought into the file. So the mesh ID for this is 2, because it's a female avatar, and the scale 0.01, and then we can import. It gives us these warnings. It's going to override the default material, which is fine, and then apply changes. And there is our beanie. This is our beanie on the mesh. So this is what you'll have to do. You might have to do this several times if you are making something for one of the more modern heads. So you're going to have to get your mesh to a certain point, export it, test to make sure that it fits, and then go back to editing your mesh. Very rarely, unless you're using the default, unless you're modeling or meshing to fit the default avatar, you're going to find that you'll have to do that quite a bit with some types of product. So that's the default. This purpley coloured thing, that's a placeholder, so we can actually go back into meshes and add our own texture. So click on that, and we should have a beanie cloth. Let's try that one. Okay, and replace. There is our beanie. At stage 1. So this test has worked. So we've exported the mesh, that works fine. It fits the head, which it works fine. The materials come in, that's fine. We've replaced it with our own image, and that shows us that the UV map is fine as well. So at this point, the test has the first look at the object live in IMVU works, so you can continue with your meshing. So you go back into Blender and start doing a bit more work. And we'll do that tomorrow because we're using up an hour and a half already. So we'll call it quits at this point. Let's save the file. Save as creatormass 2019-7. So yeah, that's a rather long process of creating a beanie hat. So we've got it to a point where we've got the basic shape in place. We've got it UV mapped, we've got it smoothed. It appears where it's supposed to be, and we've got it exported into IMVU as we're expecting it to be, which is perfect. So we know it works, so we can continue. And we'll do that tomorrow. Nice. Still looks a little bit like a headscarf, but hopefully we'll change that tomorrow by adding a bit more structure to it so that we can shape it more, make it look more like a beanie. So, on that note, we shall bid you adieu until tomorrow, which will be day 8 of Creatormass 2019. Thank you, Polly, for the name, Creatormass. So yes, until tomorrow, adieu.